We're live. Good day, everyone. My name is Amicha Marachi, and welcome to VueDX Virtual Meetup November Edition. So today we have Ben Namis, and Ben is going to be taking us about the Vue ecosystem and updates. So Ben is just a brief intro, Ben. So Ben is a senior developer experience engineer at Netlify, and he's also among the VueDX core team. Thank you, Ben, for taking our time to speak with us. The floor is yours.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Ben, you're muted.
Okay, got it. Okay, sorry, I just want to make sure. Do you have any other intros before I get started? Are we good to go?
Yes, sure, you're free to go.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's kick it off then, shall we? Oh, it looks like I need screen sharing. Looks like that's being disabled right now.
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah, no worries.
Make you. Okay, check if you can.
Okay, there you go. That should be good. All right, excellent. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Oops. Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Zoom is doing a bad job hiding. All the tools are getting in my way. Give me 1 sec. Okay, this should be much better now. All right. So welcome, everyone. So today we're here to talk about Vue 3's ecosystem. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Ben Hong. You can look me on all the Internet of Things, whether it's Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and a lot of other things. You can find me under Ben Kodzen. And so happy to chat with you all on these platforms. So as Amy mentioned, basically I work at Netlify and I'm on the Vue core team, but some of the things that you might be interested to know is that I'm also a Nuxt ambassador, so work a lot with the Nuxt team in order to sort of help sort of move the ecosystem forward. And then in addition, I'm also an instructor on Vue Mastery. So if you're looking for materials on learning how to do things, Vue Mastery, we have a lot of great video tutorials that focus a lot on animation for helping really people understand the concepts rather than simply having you just follow along, which is good for especially getting up and running when you're learning something new. And yeah, so sure to check it out if you haven't already. All right, so big question here is what is exciting about Vue 3, right? It's been out for about a year now. And so this is sort of like what we're here to talk about. Well, as a quick reminder, first thing first is that it's been completely rewritten in TypeScript. So there's first-class TypeScript support for those who are starting to look to add that into their code base. The most important thing about this, though, as a reminder, is that this is completely 100% optional. So in other words, like while TypeScript is rewritten at the Vue 3 core base, like think of it as something that's ready for you to use whenever you're ready, like basically when you're like, oh, okay, I've done the JavaScript bit. I think it's time for me to experiment or time for me to add it on for my basically my team. Then it's there for you. You don't have to do any weird shims or like sort of things to make it work with Vue 3, which was sort of the case with Vue 2, right? A lot of people had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get it to work with Vue 2, but that is no longer really the case anymore with Vue 3. So that's something for you to keep in mind. In addition, if you haven't heard already, composition API is a big part of Vue 3 in the ecosystem right now. We're not going to go into depth as far as like, getting people started with it. But I will go ahead and do like a quick overview later when we're showing examples. So people who might be new to composition API can see a little bit of what life was like or life is like when using the options API versus composition API. Because the key thing to take away from this is that it's not one or the other. So in other words, if you learn Vue writing the default way in Vue 2, that's what's currently called the options API. And that is still a valid way to write your apps. And then composition API is basically an enhancement, an alternative way to basically allow developers other ways to write their components, which we'll see later on. Okay. And so the other thing that might not be as immediately noticeable, though, is that with Vue 3, you get a lot of improved performance because Evan and the team have done a lot to improve the core rendering engine, as well as different code splitting things in order to ensure that when you optimize your build, when things are being run, you're doing it in a way that's performant, but also the best part of it, you don't really have to do anything. What's tricky a lot of time is that when you have to go inside and you have to configure Webpack to make sure certain things are web split, like, let's be totally honest. At the end of the day, you want to spend time building cool software. You want to build things that are solving people's problems. You don't necessarily want to be sitting there tweaking performance, right? Especially if these are things that are basically best practices already. And that to me is one of the things I've always loved about Vue is that it knows what you want to focus on. And it says, hey, we're going to take care of that for you right now. So for example, when it comes to looping and rendering your list of items, at some point, you're going to want to say, hey, I want to render this list of items, but please take care of the caching and stuff for me. So don't re-render it automatically unless something has changed in the dependency. And that's the kind of thing that Vue takes care of you. And so basically the stuff we love about Vue 2 has gotten even better in Vue 3. The other thing as well is that, believe it or not, even though there's all these new features that come with Vue 3, at least when the base model came out, it did not actually increase the bundle size. That's usually what you expect when a library or a framework like Vue adds new features as well. Of course, you're adding new code, right? Well, as part of the performance optimizations that I talked about in the third bullet, we also get all of this while still maintaining a small bundle size. And in fact, with the code splitting, if you're not using certain features of Vue and using like the bare minimum, it's actually even smaller than Vue 2, which is pretty impressive feat on the team, if I may say so myself. And of course, there's much more, and that is what we're here to talk about. So hopefully this is a good overview for those who might be sort of really brand new to the Vue 3 ecosystem. But of course, I'll be checking the YouTube chat as we go along the talk today. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop it along, and I'll try to make sure to answer them as we go through the presentation. All right. So let me go ahead and tweak the chat real quick. Okay, great. Looks like we're good. All right. Let's move on, shall we? All right. So did this part, and next slide. All right, Vue 3, 1 year later. So the first question you're probably thinking here is, well, should you migrate to Vue 3? And in fact, some of you probably aren't even thinking about that. You're saying, well, of course I want to migrate to Vue 3. There's all these great features, and more importantly, like you just talked about all these great things. Why wouldn't I want to do that? Well, believe it or not, I think, especially if you're talking about a legacy code base that has already been in production for a while, really the first question is really, while it might not be intuitive, is do you need to migrate? And this is important because if we think about it another way, a lot of times as developers, we want to play with the shiniest code base possible, right? We want to make sure we're keeping up to date with the latest and greatest. So we might say, okay, whatever thing we're building, we want to use the newest thing possible. But another thing I want us to keep in mind as a developer is we have to also remember, is it really responsible for us to necessarily do that? Because the truth is as quick as some migrations can be, migrations are still expensive when it comes to like slowing down the feature development in order to actually move code bases. So more importantly, for example, if your app is primarily in maintenance mode, in other words, you're not necessarily adding a ton of new features, you're just sort of like, it's going to live there, it's not really going to change that much, then I would say in that regard, might not actually be necessary to migrate. And I think that's, if you think about it, a sign of maturation on the side of an engineer's part, because you recognize the trade-offs of simply using the newest tools and saying, okay, you know what, for this app, we're not really doing that much with it. So Vue 2 is already quite performant as it is. Probably the gains that we gain from Vue 3 won't be huge because it's not going to rewrite the app. It's still basically we're in maintenance mode. However, though, if you're a brand new project, this is a completely different scenario, right? Because if you have a bunch of Vue 2 apps that are currently working well and you don't need any new feature development, but you're starting a brand new one, now this is the question. And I would say if you're starting a brand new project, honestly, yeah, it's basically a no-brainer. You want to start with Vue 3, although there are a couple sort of caveats with that, which is one, do you have any major dependencies? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have a bunch of Vue 2 sites that you're working on for your company, for your clients, and they all need to work within the same ecosystem. Well, some of the things that people use a lot in Vue, two in particular, which we'll talk about today, are Nuxt. And so Nuxt, if you haven't heard, which we'll get into later, is in Vue, like it's basically in the V3 beta. So in other words, Nux supporting Vue 3 is about to be released as a basically stable candidate soon, but it's not production ready yet. So big caveat there. However, the other one that tends to get a lot of people is that you might be using a component library that is responsible for styling your app. So the most common one for this one is actually Vuetify. And so there are other ones as well. But if you have those dependencies, well, that's something that the team doesn't necessarily have control over, right? Because there are separate open source teams that manage those libraries. So if you have those dependencies, those are a big factor as far as whether or not you're ready to actually switch over to Vue 3. Now, if you're like, okay, you know what, it's fine. We don't need Nuxt right now. We don't need Vuetify. We can get past that. We just need the official libraries. Then by all means, Vue 3 is certainly ready for you. And so I mentioned this earlier, but again, it bears worth mentioning that when you're looking at doing a migration, to weigh whether or not the benefits are actually worth the investment of time and energy. Because here's something that I know that the team is planning to do. I know it's not out yet, but if you're thinking like, well, I really wish there were some features from Vue 3 inside of Vue 2, normally that's the kind of thing that's on somebody's wish list. But I know that the team certainly has the intention where for the last minor release of Vue 2, we plan on backporting as much of the Vue 3 features as humanly possible. So while certain things like probably certain performance or optimizations might be tricky to do, or TypeScript integration, for example, but little things, or when I say little, I mean, it can make a huge difference sometimes. It's like aiming to have some sort of native support for composition API might be an example, or some of the native elements that have been introduced to Vue 3. These are things that are being discussed right now so that people who have large Vue 2 code bases that might not necessarily be worthy of spending all the time to migrate to Vue 3. Well, one of the nice things about this is that you'll be able to hopefully get some of the new features from Vue 3 inside of Vue 2 without doing all that migration. The other thing too, I think it's worth mentioning as far as migration goes, if you're like, well, you know what, the thing I really want right now is composition API, and I don't know if I can wait. I really want to try it on my code base now. Well, if that's something you want to do, there actually is an official Vue 2 composition API plugin. And in fact, this has been out in the ecosystem for quite some time now. In other words, it allows you to, as you might expect, actually use the composition API in Vue 2. And so basically it's in here, it's an official library from the Vue team. So if you want to go ahead and check that out, I'll drop that in the Zoom chat, actually the YouTube chat, so y'all can have that. And so that is something that basically worth keeping in mind. If that's something you want to, so like you basically get practice on, because I would say if there's anything that's a huge difference between Vue 2 to Vue 3, it's most certainly the composition API, because there's going to be a lot new code styles, a lot new ways of organizing your components that's unlocked as a result of the composition API. So that way, if you're like, okay, we don't have time for a migration, right? I can't convince product, can't convince management to change. But what I can do is I can use the composition API to start maybe refactoring some of the components I'm currently using, and then maybe build some new ones with the composition API. And if you're doing that, well, I got to say, you're probably like 60, 70% on the way to already using Vue 3 style syntax. So something to consider in order as a way to progressively enhance your app while still maintaining your skills as a developer. Okay. So the real question here that a lot of times, that a lot of people ask when it comes to Vue 3 and the new ecosystem is, which API should I use? Options API versus composition API. So to make sure everyone here is on the same page, let's go ahead and pull up a quick demo, shall we? So let me go ahead and clear this. Let's open this up. What I'm going to do here is start a local dev server, and we're going to show you how this works. So I'm going to bump this over 2/3, bump this over 1/3, and let's open this. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and inside of app.vue, let's go ahead and wipe this out and start over. So to show you that it's live coding here, as you can see, I'm making typos, but more importantly, here's my H1 for hello, Vue, Nigeria. And we are on the November 2021 edition. Save. Okay, so here we can see that our app is up and running. So let me go ahead and actually hide the sidebar here so that's easier to see. Now, for those of us who've been using Vue for a while or who might be new to it, basically I want to do a quick review. So prior to all of the Vue 3 excitement, this is how sort of the Vue 2 looked like in the past. So here we have where we're tracking our reactive data. So let's say this is the event title. So this might actually be VueJS Nigeria 2021 edition. And this is where if I go ahead and delete this, right, for example, and save, you'll see this has changed right here. And if I want to inject something that's reactive, I would go ahead and drop it in here. So here we go, event title. Oh, I can't type. There we go, save. There we go. There's our VueJS Nigeria, November 2021 edition. Now, of course, you're then thinking, okay, well, then how do other things work? Well, the other thing that I personally like, probably my favorite feature about Vue is the computed properties. Why? Because it says, here's my source of truth, that's data up here. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and say, what if I want to capitalize the title? And this will basically look at the event title stuff and say, hey, I'm going to take it to uppercase. And here we'll say uppercase event. And this will be capitalized title. And then if we can save this here, you'll see, here it is. In fact, it's a little small. So let me go ahead and bump this just up to an H2 actually. So I'm going to add this will be an H2. There we go. And I can't, oh, there we go. The replace had messed it up. Okay, there we go. So we can see here, this is nice. And then I'll do one more just to sort of emphasize, drive the point home. In fact, why is it yelling at me? Oh, yes, let me go ahead and actually go into this real quick and allow JS true. Okay, there you go. All right. If you're worried about what the config I did there, don't worry about that right now. Just something to basically ignore the error that we had. Okay, so finally, let's have a method to go ahead and just go ahead and add something new. So it'll be like add message to title. Or we'll just call it add message, right? And so this dot event title, it'll be plus equals, hello, this is Ben. Okay, so now if I go ahead and add a button to add message, we'll see here that when I click it, it updates exactly as you expect. And so in case you're new to Vue, this was called the options API. And why is it called options? Well, if you look at, sorry about that, hang on a sec. The reason it's called options is because if we look at what we're doing here, we're exporting a default object. And this might not have been obvious to those. I can certainly say for myself, I was using Vue for so long, I never really thought of it this way. But once it's explained, I was like, oh, that makes sense. Which is that we have a default object here. And what do JavaScript objects have? Well, they have keys. In other words, they have ways for you to find different options. Like just like when you configure something that you're receiving from an API, well, these are the options that are given to you. Data, computed, methods. These are where you define certain things, where your reactive data lives, where the computed property lives, and the methods you're going to call within your Vue app. Now, here's the thing, though, is that while options has done a lot for the Vue community, and in fact, a lot of Vue 2 popularity is contributed largely solely due to having pure options API. But what people wanted was the option to be able to do composition API. And so the flip side of this is, let's say, okay, you're like, what is composition API? How does that change from this? Well, the difference is let's start by initializing a setup hook. And so the setup is a lifecycle hook. In case you're coming from React or whatever, think of it like a created, a mounted. But setup happens at the very, very beginning at the basically component lifecycle instance. So before anything else happens, this is where it's basically all this code is run. But what's interesting about the setup function and composition API as a whole is that everything is done via vanilla JavaScript. So in other words, a lot of this stuff here where we're just configuring options to do certain things, and we have context like this, that lets you refer to the component instance, all of that disappears. Because why? Because we're in vanilla JavaScript. So this, for example, we would say const event title equals all of this. And then what we need to do actually is because the setup method, remember, is being run at the very beginning. So it's running a bunch of JavaScript code, but more importantly, you need to tell it at the very end, what exactly do you want to expose to the component? So this might feel a bit different from what you're doing with options API, but if you think about it another way, it's really not, because if you look at it this way, look at the data method, for example, right? And I say it's a method, if you look at here, because it's a function that returns an object, it's actually going ahead and telling the component, hey, by the way, these are the data properties that I want you to actually expose to the rest of the component. So this here is actually a common pattern in this regard. So we're going to expose event title. So now if I go ahead and delete this, for example, you'll see that everything still works exactly as we expect. We can see our title here is being capitalized. So what happens though if we go and click the button? Well, nothing's happening. Why? Because at this point, remember, we're in vanilla JavaScript land. So all this stuff, it has gone ahead. It's plain JavaScript. It's a constant that will never, ever change. Vue is not injecting any magic in here. So without going a full deep dive in the composition API, basically, Vue has helper methods. So for example, we can import something called a ref. So a ref here is an actual like a helper method from Vue that says, hey, by the way, oops, I can't type. I want you to go ahead and turn this value here into a reactive reference. So now if I save this, what is it not liking? Oh, of course, it's not on, there you go. So now if I go ahead and click, you can see, hello, this is Ben. It's actually being added on now because now Vue is asking that you be very explicit regarding what is normal JavaScript, that's static content, and what is actually reactive content that you want Vue to track. And ref is one of the ways to do it. So from that point on, let me just show you, let's go ahead and quickly convert this over. What if we want capitalized title to also exist in the composition API? What does that look like? Well, capitalized title is going to be a computed property. So we're going to import computed from Vue. And that will take a function, which if you look at here, we're already doing here. This is a function. And what will it do? It will return the event title, but there's no this context, so we need to delete that. And again, without getting into the details, reactive references need to be unpacked. So in other words, you need the dot value to access its value. And then just like that, we'll need to actually expose this. Let me go ahead and do this. So this will be capitalized title. And if we save here, you'll see everything to work just the same. And then finally, we'll go ahead and take the add message and convert this over. So let's go ahead and just copy paste this over. Const add message. And what is const add message? It is a function. It is a function that will take the event title dot value and it'll go ahead and append something new to it. So let me go ahead and now add this to the thing that we're exposing to the component. And voila, there we go. We have our app still working as we expect. And the nice thing about this, though, is that if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is actually fairly easy to understand, right? You have your event title, you have your capitalized title, you have your add message. And more importantly, it's very explicit about where Vue is being basically injected. Here's the ref, here's the computed. Now, as we're looking at basic trade-offs of this, the key thing to understand here is that while this might be very familiar for those working with JavaScript, something that might be a little counterintuitive is that this is not always the most easy type of syntax for people who don't have a lot of JavaScript to actually use. So for example, with Options API, because everything was basically configuring things, as long as you memorize how things were shaped, right? You're like, this is my computed, this is my method, this is how it works inside of my HTML and CSS. You actually didn't need to know that much JavaScript to make everything work. And so the example I always like to cite when talking about this is I taught a designer a few years ago at a workshop who, was really afraid actually that because she didn't know very much JavaScript, she wouldn't be able to keep up with the Vue workshop. And so because she hadn't coded in years, right? Her primary role was a designer. But within the first hour of working with the Vue 2 code base using Options API, she was up and running and understood how everything worked. Now, granted, we all know that when it comes to doing things that are more advanced and that kind of stuff, JavaScript is certainly needed. But there's something very elegant about what the Option API provides, which are standards. So people knew exactly where things go. They didn't really have to question it. What Composition API extends upon is that what happens when you want more freedom and control over how things are organized. In other words, you know how earlier we saw that there was data in one section, we saw computed in one section and methods in one section. Well, we can imagine as the code gets really long, as components grow in size, well, it's kind of tricky to jump between those, right? Because they're sorted by options rather than by features. So for example, think of all this. This right here, if we think of this code block, this right here is really just a bunch of options that help to support, like this is the message functionality, right? This has to do entirely with message. And so what's, that didn't work the way I wanted to. Okay, that's fine. There we go. 1, 2, don't add that. Thank you. Okay. So what's brilliant about this is that with the basically the composition API is that we can group things exactly as we want. So these three can stay together. And then, let's say, for instance, we want to copy this, and then we have a message to functionality, right? This is a second type of message or message to. And then all of a sudden, right, you're able to group code based on the way you want to, basically via modules or via like functionality rather than by their options. And so this is the kind of thing that it opens up. And so the key thing here to understand with this is that it's not an either or situation. As we can see here, although again, because we don't have the time to go through it in depth here, is that setup function and composition API still can exist within the options API. So in other words, to demo this real quick, actually, is let me go and delete this random bit. Is let's say this message functionality is being initialized in the composition API. Well, we can go ahead and actually extend on it and say, well, we're going to create a computer property in our options API that will go ahead and say lowercase title, right? And this will take the event title that's being initialized and exposed through composition API right here and bring it back. And we'll go ahead and run that normally. So here now, let's go ahead and do another H2 to lowercase event. And then this will lowercase title. And now we can see here we go. We can add, and then everything is still working in tandem together. In other words, everything working inside of setup works exactly the way you expect it to. But then what's nice is it plays really well with options API. So in other words, as you can see here, it's not an either or situation. That said, composition API is certainly going to be a very popular way of writing components, which is one of the reasons why I think as Vue developers, it will be important for us to understand how the composition API works and to even be able to basically be familiar with syntax and its functionality. But by no means do you have to convert your entire code base to using basically composition API only. Options API is completely valid and will be supported. So don't worry as far as any messages you hear regarding deprecation and that kind of stuff. That's not happening, at least as far as I'm aware. Okay. That said, let's go ahead and let me switch over to YouTube real quick to make sure that I didn't miss anything as far as the chat goes. Looks like refresh. Seeing basically, whoop. Okay, looks like I can't see anything in the chat. So I guess to Amy and the organizers, if there's anything being asked there that I can't see, don't hesitate to just interrupt directly inside of the Zoom chat, and I'll go ahead and make sure to address those. All right. Sounds good. Okay. Well, with that, let's keep on going. So to sort of wrap up our discussion here regarding the API, right? Composition versus options. What's really important to me about any decision you make as far as technical decisions are what your experience is when it comes to Vue. So in other words, it's easy to say that, well, everyone's using composition API, so that's what I should use, right? Very common, like FOMO, in other words, fear of missing out feeling when it comes to developers. But when we make technical decisions, we want to make sure that we're able to continue to ship quickly as a team. And so arguably, like, it's easy to, like, again, you'll see various blog posts. And this is the one thing I always caution against when people are reading the different articles that are like, options API is dead, hail composition API, that kind of stuff. To me, that always fails to address the nuance of people's decisions and contexts in which they're working with. And so whenever you see a blog post or a talk like that, honestly, to me, there's a little bit of a red flag there, because it kind of purports to know that they know exactly how everything works on your team and your code base. When, let's be honest, the most important thing at the end of the day for teams shipping code, I would say 99% of the time, which is, are you delivering the best app possible to your users in a timely fashion? And I think that's the key piece at the very end, in a timely fashion, because a lot of times as engineers, we get caught up with the optimization of like, well, is it the most optimal code base? Is it the most organized, the most refactored? And that's really great for our quality of life. But at the same time, how many apps do you use on your phone and when you're opening a website that you're necessarily going like, well, you know what, I'm really curious, what framework are they using underneath? And are they actually using things in a performant way? No, you're just saying, is this app slow or it isn't? So unless you're actually encountering problems that you think certain things can solve, that's the time where you actually consider those solutions. And so that's what I'm kind of suggesting here with the team's experience with Vue, is that if the team is still using Vue 2, right, and they're really comfortable with the options API, there's really no point in when you migrate the code base or start a new project in Vue 3 to be like, all right, everyone, we're ditching options. Don't use it anymore. We're only using composition API. I think that would be a little bit short-sighted. Instead, what I recommend is keep using options API. But then maybe what you want to do is start practicing with the composition API. So maybe like for a single component, it might be, let's try setting some stuff up with it. Let's see how it feels. And then the team can overall grow in time and see, is this worth the transition for them? That's basically what I think is important. And I want you to consider when making that decision. Oh, the other thing regarding the team's experience before I forget is that if you have people who are non-JavaScript contributors to your code base, right? Your designers are the ones getting in there. They want to make changes. Well, that's actually worth considering, because if you do everything in composition API, once again, it does provide a bit of a barrier as far as having that team iterate and move forward as a unit. So something to consider. The other thing too is that while I talked about TypeScript being a first-class citizen in Vue 3, a lot of times people are like, well, what about when it comes to options and composition API, right? And so if you're planning to go all in when it comes to TypeScript, right? Like 100%, you want to use all of the best features, then as far as I've seen so far, the ecosystem does seem to show that composition API does seem to be the most natural way for people to use TypeScript, because after all, what you're doing in there basically, as we saw, is vanilla JavaScript. So in other words, to demo this real quick, is that here, this is regular JavaScript. But if you wanted to use TypeScript, what we would be able to do is we'd be able to say, okay, well, the language here in our script block is TypeScript. And then inside of here, we can then start annotating basically TypeScript. So here, this returns a string, right? So that must return any value. Oh, sorry, this one doesn't return anything. So this one returns void. See, there you go. As you can see, TypeScript is already working, and it's using the standard syntax that people are used to when it comes to TypeScript. So in this regard, TypeScript is, if you're going to really use it all the way, and I'm talking about like all the different features, then I would say certainly composition API does seem to have a heavier, it weighs a little bit heavier in composition API's preference. That said, though, TypeScript still works in the options API. In fact, I have a whole course on it on Vue Mastery. But basically, at the end of the day, there are ways to actually make it basically make it compatible with TypeScript. So for example, we could have data properties, right? And so the data properties in here could say, well, we're going to say, this is a event title test as string, for example. I think it's actually as this. And so the syntax is a little bit different, which is why I'm saying if you're an options API, you're dealing with a slightly different world when it comes to what that is. So and so there's ways to define the various options. Again, this is not a TypeScript talk, so I'm not going to go into it. But just know TypeScript does work everywhere. But for those of us who are hardcore, or why I say us, I wouldn't include myself in there. For those who are hardcore TypeScript users, certainly look a little bit more into the composition API. But once again, the types that you expose inside of here will get exposed as well into the options. So there's a way of hybridizing those approaches in case you have some of the team that's still working towards it and that kind of thing. So that's something for you to explore as far as team makeup and that kind of thing goes. Now, the other thing here is really, again, the question that I want to drive home when making any technical decision for a team, which is, does the composition API actually solve a problem that you have that the options cannot? And if we think about also our maturity as developers, it is being able to determine those nuances and trade-offs when we're architecting our apps. So in other words, while composition API is very, very shiny, and we talked about, the ability to be flexible with our architecture, if your app is actually working really well in options, if your app is being developed at a speed people understand everything that's happening, there's no reason to really use composition API, to be totally honest. In other words, keep moving forward. Now, if you start noticing that, like, I want to try to organize my code a little bit differently, or maybe there are some code that is better shared, that I can use composition API to share code rather than mixins, for example. That's one where I'll say, if you're thinking about using mixins in basically from the Vue 2, the concept that's carried over, then in that case, if you're in Vue 3, that's the time to definitely try composition API instead, for example. And so these are the kind of questions you want to ask yourself when thinking about, well, should I use options or composition API as my primary mechanism? Because again, the key thing I think is not to be absolute about anything. Some apps are so simple that like it makes sense to just, anyways, and it has nothing to do with simplicity. It has everything to do with sort of these sort of contextual problems. So I implore you to go ahead and think about that when you're going ahead and making that decision. Okay, so I see that we have a question here from the audience. So the question here is, does this mean you can combine composition API with the options API together in the same code. Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. As you can see here, we have our composition API right here, and we have our options all in the same component, not even the same code base. And so the key thing to understand, though, is that everything that happens in the composition API happens first. In other words, it's a top-down kind of thing. In other words, if we go ahead and actually not even go ahead. Oh, wait, I did not even define this correctly. This is a computed property called lowercase title. How the? Oh, wait, no, that was right. I know why this is weird. It's because that should be out here. I was like, that looks funny. Okay, so here's my thing to you, is that the difference here, let me delete this. In fact, like title 3, that way nothing's breaking. Okay. Once you define everything in composition API, it's done, it's set up, because it's happening at the very beginning. Think of those lifecycle hooks. So when you define stuff in the options API, though, like lowercase title, this cannot be referred to in the composition API. So that is a gotcha when it comes to using it, because this is one of those things where it's one-way direction. There's a one-way direction when it comes to this. So something for you to keep in mind when making these sort of decisions, but just know that it's a top-down flow when it comes to using both composition API and options together. Okay, let's go ahead and let's move into tooling, shall we? So first thing first, how are the dev tools? Did I switch this up? Oh, yes, this is right. Okay, dev tools, first thing first. Well, basically, if you haven't checked it out already, if you're using Vue 3, it's time to use a different Vue dev tools. In fact, I believe now it actually also has support for Vue 2, but basically it's still in beta mode. So just know that you might have to switch between the two. And so if you just Google Vue.js DevTools beta, there's a link in the slides, which I'll go ahead and tweet about later so that the organizers can share this info with you. This is where basically you're going to have the brand new DevTools that are in the Vue 3 ecosystem. So as we can see here, let me go ahead and open this up right here. Here is our brand new DevTools. So let me go ahead and look at the inspector for a second. Let's go ahead and go over here. So we can see, right, if we take a look at, let me go and refresh. There we go. We can see here, we can actually see all of our reactive data references, what's happening. And you can see here that things are actually being set up inside of setup method. And that's what's actually quite cool, is that it actually distinguishes for you what's in the composition API versus what's actually inside of the options API. And so inside of here, then you get a lot of other things. But one of the cool things, for example, that's new and shiny is that there's actually an event listener here. So that as I'm go ahead and typing and adding stuff in, you can actually take a look at what is actually being happened, right? When it's clicked, what position it's in. You can see things like what's being typed, is something being held. And so a lot of neat little developer experience enhancements have come down the pipe as a result. And so if you're using Vue 3, and eventually, again, I believe there will be a backwards compatibility to Vue 2 as well, this is the brand new dev tool. So be sure to check that out. Okay, and then what about VS Code extensions? Well, basically in the past, there was Vetur, which everyone was using. And so it looks like going forward for Vue 3, we will be utilizing Volar as the VS Code extension recommendation of choice. Earlier, I know that kind of flashed by really quickly, but VueDX is another one that's written by core team member Rahul, who has been working on sort of additional ideas. And so I believe as far as like the official one right now to pay attention to, if you're working with Vue 3, please disable Vetur and use Volar for your Vue 3 apps. And so also the thing worth mentioning regarding Volar is the big differentiator as far as Vetur, Volar, and that kind of thing is the TypeScript support. And so to be clear about that, when I say TypeScript support, it doesn't mean you need to be using types. That's, I think, what is really nice about the way TypeScript does exist in the ecosystem, is that even when someone's not using JavaScript, they can leverage those types already in their code base. So in other words, when we're hovering over things and getting definitions, believe it or not, those are all types, right? Someone has to tell the compiler or the code, or like the code editor in this case, hey, this is a specific type, this is what it does, so this is what the user can expect. And to be honest, I would say that, if you ask me, is the most realistic way to approach TypeScript, is that it's a way of just documenting your code. A lot of people use it to do a lot of other things as far as like controlling values and that kind of stuff. But at a high level, if you just sprinkle on the TypeScript from a documentation perspective, I found that's a pretty useful way of getting started. But that's to be saved for another time, another talk. Okay, the other one, as far as the command line interface. So Vue CLI is something that I imagine most of you have been using, but going forward, as we're starting to move away from a Webpack ecosystem where things were actually rather slow, we're actually now moving into something called Vite, which if you haven't heard about is a new, basically a bundler, sort of like local dev server that was actually built by Evan, who founded Vue. But what's really interesting about the Vite community is that one, it's built upon native ES modules, which is basically a new performant way of importing things, and just suffice to say, it makes things very, very fast. That's what Vite basically is French for. It's French for the word, I think, fast. So that's why it's called Vite. And the reason I'm very excited about Vite, and even though it's not directly applicable to Vue in the sense that it's not exclusive, well, Vite is actually something that we're seeing the whole web community starting to sort of rally behind. So in other words, the React community, Svelte community, we're seeing different meta frameworks like Astro get behind it. And that to me is really exciting, because what this means is that we're seeing the open source community starting to band behind a tool that's no longer framework specific. And then as a result, this means that all of the frameworks will start to actually really gain the benefits of this. And because people are contributing different ideas from different frameworks, I think we're going to see a really robust ecosystem. And if you ever wanted to look into a new project, the Vite is definitely one that's quite exciting. So be sure to check that out if you like the kind of bundler stuff as far as like Webpack, rollup, that kind of stuff. Vite is definitely worth taking a look into. Okay, how about libraries, right? We talked a little bit about libraries earlier, but I want to give kind of an official update. Routing and state management. Well, as you know, the Vue ecosystem, one of the things we want to do is always have an official recommendation as far as what you want to use for what basically version of Vue you're using. So in other words, like you don't have to worry and go and like figure out what other third parties are supporting. We will support some native libraries for you when it comes to things like routing and state management. So Vue 3 already has our official Vue Router 4, and so that's already set up. So if you want to check that out, use it. It's already working. And also, we already have Vuex 4 as well. In other words, so we basically ported all of Vuex, and we ported that over. And so it works perfectly with Vuex, Vuex 4 works perfectly with Vuex 3. Wow, brain fart. It's working perfectly with Vue 3. But that said, the reason why I'm having a pause here is because there's a new state management library that is worth keeping an eye on, because it's actually from another one of our core team members, Eduardo, who who actually does maintain the router one, which is this state management library called Pinia. And so Pinia is basically an evolution of what VueX basically has been, and a way to sort of rethink through the Redux-based pattern and figure out how we can make stores a lot more easier to use. And so in case you're wondering though, Pinia is being considered as a potential candidate as far as its style for how Vuex 5 will basically be, because a lot of people have gotten it's been a few years since we've had the Redux pattern, and it's a lot to say, oh, well, I have to write my actions, I gotta write my mutations, and well, basically Pinia is the store solution that I'm personally recommending right now if you're using Vue 3 as an app. And to be honest, it has Vue 2 support as well. So if for whatever reason you're starting a brand new Vue 2 app, but want to try out a brand new store management, Pinia is there for you, and I recommend that you check it out. It's pretty great. All right, Nux 3. So in case you didn't know, Nux 3 is in public beta right now. So in other words, you can actually install and play around with it, and you can actually deploy it. But it's not fully feature parity, it's not, it doesn't have all the feature parity that you would expect with Nux 2. And there's a reason for that, because as I need to mention again, it is in public beta, which in other words, to be very, very explicit, not for use in production. Please do not use in production unless, again, you're ready for something buggy, or you're just like you're deploying your own site. It's a fun project. By all means, deploy it, share the link. But in terms of like client reliability and not having downtime and reducing bugs, I'd recommend holding off on using Nux 3. That said, though, because it is in public beta, that means you can expect that it will be released as a stable candidate at some point in the near future. I think they're aiming for Q4, which I know we're basically in already for 2021, but we still have all of December and stuff for them to decide that. But basically just know that probably within the next few months, at the latest, we should see some exciting new ventures coming out of Nux 3. And with that, I'm very excited because I think that this is one of the ones a lot of people are waiting for when it comes to the Vue 3 ecosystem. So, but by all means, you can start playing with it already. All right. So the other one that has to bear mention, because I believe it is the largest component library that people are using when it comes to design and that kind of stuff, is Vuetify. And so at least last I checked with the Vuetify site, it is basically targeted for February 2022. So in other words, while it's certainly live as an alpha and the beta is intended, I think, for next month, what we're seeing here is that the Vue 3 ecosystem is going to start to be very, very, very exciting in Q1 of 2022, because with Nux, Vuetify, I think once those are stable and out, we're going to see a lot of maturity in the ecosystem as far as like people starting to adopt, to migrate, and then we can see people creating new stuff. And it's going to be very, very exciting. So really looking forward to Q1 of 2022. All right. Finally, the other one I want to mention here is that if you haven't heard about it before, Petite Vue is basically a CDN version of Vue, which already existed in Vue 2. But what's particularly nice about it is that it's super small. So Petite, it's for small. And I mean, I'm talking like, I want to say 16 kilobytes, like it's super, super small. So in other words, if you have an app that you are like a website you're maintaining, that's a legacy one, let's say it's built on Ruby on Rails or Java's powering it, and you can't necessarily redo everything as far as build tools, right? You can't just like inject a Vue CLI app. There's other things controlling it, but you want to actually sprinkle in some Vue, just like some reactivity, some stuff to make it reactive for your users so it's more delightful. Well, Petite Vue basically allows you to drop it in directly as a CDN. In other words, you just import it as a script, and then you target, and then you set everything up. So actually, let me just open this up real quick to show you like the example code base that they have here. So you can see here that you would just import your script here on your page. So you just have it a backend, insert this script inside of the page that you're looking at. And then after that, you can literally just anywhere on the page. You don't need to like mount it or whatever. You just add your vscope in order that defines your data, that kind of stuff. And then you use Vue just as you would expect, and it would just work. And the great thing about this here is that it is only, I said 16, it is 6 kilobytes. Talk about a performance enhancement. Now, granted, it is not the exact thing as Vue because it's Petite Vue, in other words, a smaller version of Vue, it's a subset. So certain functionality that you might be expecting when it comes to like a fully featured Vue, again, don't have time to go into that today, but just know this is available for you if this is something you're trying to do. Okay, so we have that. And then the other thing here too is that if you're looking to actually get into mobile development as far as like building mobile apps, but you want to approach it from the web perspective, just like desktop apps and that kind of thing, check out Capacitor. They've been doing some really great work. And that's a framework that will allow you to basically build your app in Vue, and then it'll help compile it over into an actual mobile app. So if you haven't checked that out, Capacitor is the way to go. Okay, so to kind of, as far as some new things in Vue 3 that I want to mention. So when I say new in Vue 3, right, we talked actually a lot about Vue 3. I'm actually referring to the minor version release that happened recently in 3.2. And so there's this idea of script setup, style vbind. So what exactly is this? So to show you this code example here, earlier, we showed you that we have this, here's like options API using composition API, right? We see here at the top, we have the export default with the setup lifecycle hook. Now, the thing about this particular, like the way the code's written here is that it's a little verbose in the sense that if you're only using composition API, this does feel like a lot of boilerplate, right? You have to export default object, you have to tell it the setup, and then you have to tell the component what you're exposing. What if we could simplify this a little bit more? And so in other words, what if we could say, hey, we're gonna add this setup method at the very top, and we're going to append this into the script. And we're going to tell Vue basically that in the script block, it will only be composition API. So as a result, we can remove the default exported object. And then since we already have the setup, basically the setup attribute on script setup, we don't need the setup lifecycle hook like we just find right here. So that can disappear as well. And what's really cool is that because now we're in pure composition API world, and we can allow to do some like developer experience enhancements with Vue and the compiler, right? This is very important. Like the server running everything is what's responsible for this. We can actually even remove what's manually being exposed to the component because Vue can go ahead and figure the rest of that stuff out. And so believe it or not, we've now simplified our code a lot from the standard composition API to pure composition API inside of a script setup block. And this is an optimization that's available in 3.2 and above. And so we can see here, this is really nice now because you have your import, you've declared your const of my color, and it's a reference of red, and then everything still works as expected in 2 lines of code, right? That's a lot of boilerplate that disappears. In addition, the other feature I want to cover as far as the vbind goes is that, well, as you can currently see right now, inside of this template, we have a click event where it's saying, hey, when you click on this, we're going to switch my color to be either red or green, depending on what it currently is. So if it's red, switch it to green. If it's not red, then switch it to red. And then what we're doing is we're doing some inline styles regarding, well, let's define the color based on whether or not what the color is defined on the user end. And so this works, right, as far as like the code. But you're probably thinking like, well, it would be nice if we could do this inside of CSS. So how would that work in a perfect world? Well, we'd probably say we'd have a selector. Let's keep it simple. Let's call it button. And then what we do is we'd move the inline style inside from the template into our CSS. And so we say, oh, the color is ideally this thing called my color. Now, here's the thing you're probably thinking, though, Ben, this does not work, right? CSS will interpret that literally as my color and not as JavaScript. So how do we change that? Well, let's go ahead and move that up to 1 line to make it easier to read. But then the brilliant thing about this is there's a new syntax inside of Vue 3.2 and up, which is that you can actually run the vbind on my color. And believe it or not, that will actually go ahead and make everything work exactly as you expect. And so to show you how that works exactly, let's go ahead and bump this over, open this up. Let me close that. Okay. Let's say, for example, we want to go ahead and say, hey, for our HTML page, we want a background color that's going to be dynamic. So let's say, for example, I'm going to say yellow, right? So now we can see everything is yellow. So we say, okay, we want to define this in a way that says, hey, we want to make sure that this is actually reflective of, let's see, let me go ahead and just define it inside of the options data here. So we can say, okay, let's call this page background. And then to change it, I'm going to say it's going to be blue. That's what we're going to say. And so inside of here, though, you're probably like, well, okay, how does this work exactly? Well, we would vbind page background just like that. And so if I save this, save this, and this, of course, is deciding not to cooperate with me at the last second. Let me try something real quick. Const test equals red. Close test real quick. Is this running? What is happening? Dun, dun, dun. Oh, I know why. Var test, yes. Is that because this? Okay. Okay. Sorry, I made the mistake of selecting the HTML element. Vue does not have control over that. So sorry, let me just go ahead and redo this real quick to make sure the demo example is clear. Let me do a div example of ID content, and let's do the ID of content again. So let's restart that example so that everyone understands from the beginning. So here, let me go ahead and delete lowercase title. Let me delete this computer section real quick so everything can be easily seen on 1 line of code. Sorry, 1 page. All right, excellent. So we can see here now is that we have this yellow that's hard-coded to the app that Vue is controlling. But then we can do a vbind here where we say, yes, this is going to be page background. And so now if we say this, you can see everything has swapped over. And so if we look inside of here, what exactly is happening? Well, we can see here that Vue is actually going in and it's saying it's dynamically replacing and creating a CSS variable called page background that's prepended by a hash to ensure that nothing ever conflicts with it. But what's beautiful about this, though, is that this means now that all of a sudden we can now use CSS for what it's best at, which is cascading, specificity, and sharing styles. But with stuff like this now, well, we can then say, let's go ahead and say, let's give this a border of 2px solid, and then we can vbind page background. Now we save that. We can see here that this also now has the same exact border. And so actually I realized it's not going to be as obvious here. So maybe we'll just go ahead and maybe change the color. Oh, I forgot. It's a button, so it is much more sensitive when it comes to default. There we go. Now these two things share the exact same background color, but it's using JavaScript to manage all this. And to show you how this, like why this is particularly cool, let's go ahead and say, let me add an input out here, and let's give it a type of color, right? And so if you didn't know already, in HTML, there is an actual type color input that allows you to actually use a color picker, which is super, super useful in this kind of case. Because what we can do is we can say vModel on the page background. Because what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're going to take the page background and we're going to let the user define exactly what we want. And what's cool about this here now is, oh my gosh, I hit the wrong thing. And then we can see here, check it out. Infinite personalization for users, which is super exciting because now all of a sudden, things that might have been very expensive to do in the past when it comes to allowing users to personalize different bits and how it impacted styles across the border, and whether it's things like padding, margins, line gaps, that kind of thing. With this new vbind syntax in our styles, this gives us so much power to allow for just a little bit of customization on the user side. And so just enough JavaScript that says, hey, this piece is dynamic. Then we leverage what's powerful about the browser as far as CSS engine and that kind of thing. Like, why recreate everything? That's always been my biggest question about CSS in JavaScript or JavaScript in CSS is it seems like a lot of times we're reinventing things and people who don't understand CSS are trying to implement things. But with this, this is the perfect marriage between dynamic pieces with what already exists, whatever is efficient, and what works really well. So, all right. So I see here some people in chat having this connection between CSS and script is so powerful, right? This is very cool, blew my mind. Does this have backward compatibility to Vue 2? As of this moment, it does not, from what I understand. It is a 3.2 specific feature, but that's not to say, though, that I wouldn't be able to see this being a candidate for being released under the Vue 2.7 release. Because if we look at least as far as, okay, if you're looking at basically Vue, if you're in Vue 2 and you're like, how does this work, right? Because we're engineers, we want to know this. Basically, the way to think about it is this way, right? And this is a little bit manual would have to be a little bit manual on your part. But there's actually a dynamic CSS variable being injected as an inline style. So if you were to manually recreate this, it would kind of be the same thing as saying, well, we're going to have an inline style here, and then we're going to define a new variable that's called my custom variable. And then we're going to inject, page background. This is kind of what's basically happening. And then right here, you're technically saying, yes, well, I'm going to use the variable, my custom variable, right? If you had to implement it manually, this is how you would do it. Now, the reason why, certainly the vbind syntax is very, very clean and everything's managed for you. So the downside to having to do this is certainly you have to manage your hashes on your own. You have to ensure there's not any conflict. And then you have to make sure that things are imported correctly. So there is a little bit of a, you got to jump through some hoops to make it happen. But just know that this is the underlying technique. And I think that's the most important thing when I want to teach things about Vue is that while there's certainly abstraction to make our lives easier, the key thing here is you understand how it works with stuff like this so that in the event you're limited for whatever reason, you know that this is the technique being used underneath so that you can still use what's powerful about JavaScript with what makes CSS really, really great. Easily one of my favorite features. I'm glad so many people are so excited about this because I certainly am, honestly. As a front-end developer, I love writing in CSS, but I do want some JavaScript dynamic pieces to it, right? And so this, to me, is the perfect marriage between the two. My love of CSS with my love of Vue and bringing those together to make things quite awesome indeed. Okay, so with that, Yeah, so those are the two main things I want to talk about with the brand new Vue 3.2 features. There are basically some RFCs in play right now. So RFCs, if you didn't know, stands for request for comments. In other words, these are like proposed features that are being talked about. So if you didn't know already, I believe is github.com/Vue.js, that's RFCs. Yep, I'm right. So I'll drop that in the channel here where, but anyways, the RFCs allow you to sort of check out what's being talked about for new features, and people are discussing pros and cons of that. If you're interested in getting to Vue architecture things, RFCs are a great place to have that those discussions. And so there's things being talked about in there regarding ref triggers and that kind of stuff, which I won't go into because these aren't official things, they're being discussed. So just know if you want to hang out there, please be sure to check it out. Okay, so to wrap things up, so now we're at the hour at this point. Basically, whether you're a Vue veteran or you're new to the framework, it really is an exciting time to be in the Vue ecosystem because there's a lot of chance to have new opinions, to talk about different patterns, and to explore, right? To innovate. And so, I think it's certainly really great. And this is your iceberg meme where, this talk, we talked about a few number of things. We covered a lot of things, but it was really at a high level. There's a lot of stuff happening elsewhere, right? Whether it's in the official Vue docs, whether it's in the Vue Discord, RFCs that we just talked about, the official repos, Nux docs, GitHub discussions. I mean, gosh, there is a lot to go on. But what this also means is that this is super exciting because if you want to deep dive ever, or you want to talk to other people, there's a whole lot of places waiting for your opinions and for you to have this conversation. So with that said, please, if you ever have any questions or you want to look at some, check out the official docs. There we try to explain whatever we can. If there's something missing, you're like, gosh, I really could use a better explanation, or this part is kind of confusing, file an issue. We'd love to hear from you. We're always looking to make the docs better so that Vue can always be a progressive framework that is approachable to everyone regardless of their skill level. And then if you're looking for composition API stuff, once again, I know we gave a very high level overview of it earlier, but I have a completely free mission. Basically, it's a video course on the Netlify platform Jamstack Explorers, and it's called Launching with Composition API. So if you want to walk through the whole thing and watch your videos and get up and running, that is the video course for you. Granted, there are other ones on the ecosystem, but that one is there, is completely free for you to learn. Finally, if you want to follow me on other work that I do, please visit my site, benkozen.io. I usually include the schedule there as far as times I'm speaking or streaming. So I live stream twice a week. Typically, I didn't live stream this week. But then there's also all the resources I've created. So if you click on the Learn tab, I'll be updating that with all the various courses I've created and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, just basically bookmark that if you want to go ahead and connect on that stuff and follow along. And with that said, at least as far as officially closing off this talk, I know as you can see we have some chats coming up, so don't worry, I'll save for some Q&A. Thank you everyone for coming to the talk. Once again, I'm on Ben Codezen on all the things. So whether it's on Twitter, YouTube, or Twitch, you can find me there. I'm happy to connect and interact with you all there. So with that, it's time for questions. So let's go ahead and let me look at the chats. Okay, so here's a question here from Ibrahim. And so it says, I have a situation here where I'm trying to render images dynamically on the response I get from an API call. So the images all live in the images folder in the assets folder where the dynamic IV bind source changes. Where the image doesn't fetch the new image, rather it displays the previous image. So I'll give an example. So in this case, the example here is a weather app. And so it starts out with like the condition, whether it's rainy, sunny. But then when they look for the weather condition of Dubai, for example, then there basically is a way that go ahead and brings over the image source value. And so it looks like it doesn't re-render the new image. Try using a function that returns the source full value. Okay. Yes. Okay. So this is a tricky one. Dynamic image imports is always one I think that seems to catch people off, is because when you're importing the path, while ironically enough, when you just hard code it, then everything, as you can see, it renders correctly. But as you can see, so Abraham, I think the easiest thing for us would be to honestly, if you sent like, hit me up on Twitter or whatever, and then let's take a look at the code snippet, because when it comes to importing images, basically the bundler has to be able to identify where the path is. So you mentioned here about the require. So I wonder why require doesn't work. but I think if we take a look at the code together, it'll be easier to debug. But basically, for those of you working with dynamically rendering images, just know that you can't simply just swap out the path dynamically, because one of the things that build tools have done for us with front end is, while it's done a lot of good things for us, sometimes it's abstracted some of the magic away, so that when weird things like this come up, it's a little bit weird. So for example, when you have your path right inside of a view app, that's like, I'm going back a directory, I'm going to my images, I'm going to import an image. What's that doing is the bundler actually knows to actually where your path is, and it'll go and like fetch those paths, right? But here's the thing. On production, if you think about it another way, if you go ahead and say, I'm going to dynamically switch that path doesn't actually exist anymore. There's no context for it. So what you're switching in is a plain string. It's no longer a file path. And that's one of those things that like might not be immediately obvious for those working with dynamic image rendering for the first time. And so this is where usually there are some strategies that, depending on your situation, that you can use for that. But just know, if that's happening, that actually is expected behavior. It's not necessarily a view bug, but rather something that a side effect that's resulted as a result of all these different build tools. So Ibrahim, let's check connect afterwards.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, Timothy, go ahead, go for it.
Okay. First of all, thanks a lot, Ben. That was really a lot to learn, and I've been following you a lot online, and seeing you here is just amazing. Yeah. So my question is, after learning the syntax, the API, it gets to a point where, as a developer, you just sort of want to go beyond the basics. You want to sort of you just want to go advanced and learn some. You want to sort of learn insights, so to say, architecture and all of that. What resources would you recommend to check out that goes beyond the basics, and sort of teaches architecture, insights, and some advanced stuff in Vue?
Yeah, this is a great question. So just to reiterate the question to make sure I understand. So basically, the question here is regarding where to go beyond the basics, right? What happens in terms of Vue architecture and that kind of thing. And so why is it not? There you go. Okay. So one person to follow on Twitter that I would actually highly recommend is someone called Michael Thiessen. And so actually, I'm going to drop his newsletter to be actually more specific, because he often tweets out like little patterns, or let me drop this in the chat for everyone. And in fact, let me add this into my notes so that I can collect this together for people later. So basically, Michael Thiessen will do a lot as far as like different patterns he's shared as far as his work experience. But the other one that's worth mentioning that will actually, I think probably within the next year, there will be a lot more advancement in this, is that one of the things I inherited from a past team member here is Chris Fritz, is the Vue Enterprise boilerplate. And so inside of here, you'll basically see a collection of patterns that Chris had over time with consulting, had basically built up, and some of the stuff he uses as far as, this is particularly for Vue 2, so just to add that as a caveat. But the Vue 3 one will be coming as we sort of, as I work on like sort of like how to manage those things. And the key thing here as well is that, why does it keep doing that? So, so production grade Vue is another app that, let me see. Here is a front-end master's course that you can go ahead and check out. But I know that, sometimes when it comes to courses and stuff, it's really expensive to just keep paying for a bunch of different ones. So one of the things that, let's see, so I think towards the end of this year, I'll probably doing some giveaways as well. So if people want to reach out to me, we can talk about like, free memberships to that. But in the meantime, though, I don't want to hold anyone up from that. Here are the, I thought there was the website here. Okay, well, anyways, here's the repo. I'll go ahead and add the website. I could have sworn, I did. So if you define, yeah. Okay, I was gonna say, here are the official docs. So again, let me add this to my list so I can put this all together for everyone later. Here we go, GitHub there. And so if you read this guide, this will allow you to kind of see some of the opinions as far as different patterns, recommendations as far as how things can be used. And so the key thing as well, to your point, Timothy, regarding additional patterns is honestly find leaders and stuff in the community that are sort of outspoken about this stuff. So another person that I really admire on the core team, and she's really great, is Natalia. She talks a lot about her experience at GitLab and that kind of stuff. And so she's awesome. And one more person I'm going to recommend actually that I'm going to drop is Jessica Sachs. She's doing a lot of really great work at Cypress. So when it comes to testing and, oh, why can't I find her right now? Maybe she's not on. Oh, there she is. I was going to say, oh, she has an underscore in her name. Yes. Ibrahim, give me 1 second. We will, I would drop that here. And then finally, in case anyone wants to reach out, here we go. There's my Twitter as well. So again, it's under Ben Kyojan. So okay, anyways, Jessica does a lot of fantastic work in the testing community. So basically, especially as the Vue 3 ecosystem matures, I've given you some basically places for you to follow. So with Enterprise Boilerplate and these sort of the courses that I've created, but more importantly, all these individuals are doing a lot of speaking and stuff. So especially because a lot more events online are being broadcasted and a lot of them are free, I would, as much as possible, try to keep track of those, or YouTube especially. I think a lot of events are recording and posting those. So in other words, Timothy, that was a very long-winded way to say there's a lot of development and actually excitement happening in it. And when we talk about intermediate and advanced, so one thing I always want to communicate is that usually the idea of intermediate and advanced, in other words, is taking those concepts and applying them to specific contexts. So in other words, when you're learning from people, keep an eye on what problem they're solving. But believe it or not, as I try to tell people a lot who take my workshops, when I'm like sort of doing consulting and that kind of thing, if your code is working and it's solving your problem well, honestly, you're probably using an intermediate advanced pattern already. You just, maybe someone hasn't named it yet. But more importantly, the time you should be looking for patterns, in my opinion, that really starts to help is when you're starting to knowing something wrong with something. That I find is the time where the patterns are most applicable. So in other words, let's say you're using mixins, for example. That's a common one that people ran into in Vue 2 because they were trying to, like, share code between their components. And then they're realizing they're dealing with name conflicts, right? They're like, well, it's becoming hard for me to identify which thing comes from which mixin, and that is one of the straight downsides of mixins. Then that's the time where you go, I'm looking for a way to solve mixin problems. Let's see what patterns are out there. And that's when, for example, you'll learn about composition API and other techniques. And so if you approach your learning that way, I think that provides the most applicable and impactful type of knowledge you'll learn when developing your skills. Because the one thing I've had trouble with is I will tell you, I am guilty of buying all sorts of courses and books, trying to be like, okay, I'm going to learn as many patterns as I can, hopefully, and I'll know the right one to use at the right time. But to what I was saying earlier, if you can focus more on the problems you're trying to solve, that way there's more of that application of technique, if that makes sense. Does that help to answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks
Yeah.
for the resources. Yeah, I'll check them out.
Absolutely. And of course, Timothy, as you have questions, as you're learning, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to continue that conversation. Great. Okay, so it looks like for whatever reason, I don't know why the chat isn't showing up on my end, but more of that, I think that is it as far as questions for today. So I don't know if Amy, if there are any sort of closing thoughts for us to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Ben. I don't know if anyone have any more questions to ask. The floor is still open. And if you can ask a question here, you can easily reach out to Ben. He's very accessible and responsive. So yeah, you can reach out to him for any more questions. So I think if there's no more question, we've come to the end of today's section. See you all in December.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.
Hi, Linda.
We can end.
Yes. Yeah, I'm ending it now. Hi, everyone.
Seems there's nowhere to leave or something.
You can just click the button down. There's a
Okay.
link button.